Hello, everyone, and welcome to my home. I'm Katie Couric, and this is our first behind the scenes podcast on the making of my memoir, Going There. I feel like a PBS host or NPR host, and I'm going to talk about sweaty balls pretty soon. But I won't because I'm here with two of my favorite people who, are a little sensitive. Kidding. This is Lucy Kaylin and Adriana Fazio. We are the troika behind Going There. And so we thought it would be fun to give you guys a little behind the scenes sense of what it took to put together this 500 page plus memoir that hopefully that you all are reading and enjoying or getting ready to read or have pre-ordered. You can go to Amazon and any other place to. Can you go to Amazon?
You can Amazon or anywhere where you prefer to buy books.
Yes, exactly. Support your local bookstore, by the way. Just FYI. Anyway, we're going to basically introduce ourselves. I'm Katie Couric. You probably knew that by now. Lucy, why don't you introduce yourself and how you got involved? Well, first introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about how you got involved in this project.
I'm Lucy Kaylin.
Lucy, can you give us a little more?
Sure. I mean, I am thrilled to be here. This is one of the best things I've ever been engaged in. We'll get into that more, I'm sure. But longtime magazine person, writer, editor. Most recently the editor-in-chief of Oprah Magazine, and I'm currently VP of print content at Hearst. Been at GQ, been at Vogue, been at Mary Claire. Love words, love great stories, and that's what finds me here.
And Ms. Fazio, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Adriana Fazio. I'm 24 and this is my first job.
24 going on 42.
Yeah.
Adriana is an old soul. Why don't you talk, Adriana, real quickly about how you and I met, because it's such a funny story.
Tale as old as time. Okay. So I went to Notre Dame and I was a double major in American Studies and film. And for one of my film classes, we had to write about the most impactful media experience we ever had. And I wrote about the Today Show, and then it turned into a senior thesis about Katie. And through a friend of a friend, someone connected me to Katie, and then I interviewed her for my thesis.
Which was called?
Katie Couric's Career in Shifting Perceptions of Femininity in Broadcast Journalism.
Ta-da! And why don't you tell us a little bit about why you were so captivated by me
Yeah,
when you were a young lass watching the Today Show?
That's a very good question. So in my thesis, I detail every single day, without fail, the Today Show was on in my household. And I would have my little Catholic school jumper on, and I would sit eating my Eggo waffles, watching Katie on the Today Show. And I wanted to be Katie. I wanted to host the Today Show. I wanted to go into broadcast journalism. And I realized at a very young age that was just what I wanted to do. And
Adriana was very precocious.
Yeah.
I think just tell that hilarious story about Adriana had a little bucket hat. She was on an airplane with her mom. And tell that story because I think that kind of encapsulates why you're a bit of a mini me.
So, right. Okay. So, one time I was flying with my mom and my brother from Boston to LA, and that's a very long flight to have a 6 and a 4-year-old. And I said, Mom, I wonder how many people on this plane are going on vacation, how many people have a layover, and how many people are going home. And so I proceeded to ask the entire plane person by person.
Your mom said, why don't you take a survey?
Right. My mom said.
And by the way, props to Tara for saying that.
Yeah,
because,
that's great.
she encouraged you to satisfy
Totally.
your curiosity.
Yes.
So you had a little, notebook.
Right. And my purple glasses, very important detail, and my bucket hat. And I went. We have a photo of this. I went person by person and woke them up and was like, excuse me,
Wow.
sir. Where are you going? My mom saw me waking up middle-aged men. She was like, don't wake him up. And so I was just a very curious, very precocious child.
And by the way, at the end of the flight, I know the story better than you do,
sorry.
Adriana.
I don't know how much detail we need here.
Well, just tell me at the end of the flight and that'll put a button on it.
Okay, and at the end of the flight attendants came over the speaker and said, excuse me, everyone, we have the results from Adriana's survey. And the whole plane clapped, and they gave me chocolate chip cookies, and I came off a hero.
I think that's the cutest
It's the
story,
cutest.
isn't it?
It's the cutest story ever.
And it's so Adriana in her purple glasses.
It really is.
You ended up, Adriana, just to finish the story of the thesis, you ended up getting in touch with me through that friend of a friend. You came over to my apartment. You interviewed me. You were so funny.
I was so nervous.
She was nervous and
sweating.
You were. I didn't notice you were sweating. And but you asked me all these questions, and that's when I said, "Hey, I'm thinking about writing a book. Maybe you'd like to help me research it because you know more about me than I know about me because she had done this exhaustive research." So that's how you ended up sitting on my sofa, living with me through the pandemic, and basically tying my shoes every morning.
Yes.
We call Adriana my companion, which we think is funny, as if I'm 95, where, I'm getting there. And sometimes I'll say, where are we,
You're not getting
Adriana?
there, you're going there.
I'll say, where are we, Adriana? And she'll say, we're in East Hampton, Katie. Anyway, all right. So, Lucy, let's talk about how we became thick as thieves. We were put together to work on this book because I needed someone to help me shape it and make sense of this crazy life of mine. And one of the best things that has ever happened to me is someone said, why don't you work with Lucy Kaylin? And you had never really, you'd written books yourself, but you had never really been in this kind of situation. Tell us about the books you wrote first.
Sure. I wrote a book about American nuns, and I grew up without any religion at all, and I was very, very deeply curious about the women who still did this work or responded to this call because I knew that the numbers were declining rapidly. So I thought it was an interesting story for women, about women and subcultures and all the rest. And funnily enough, I got the opportunity to plug my book on the Today Show. And you interviewed me, and which was
Lucy. You were funny telling me about it because you said you were super nervous, right?
Yeah.
And you were so good. You would never in a million years guess that you were nervous.
Well, that's great, but I will say, and this is completely true. I was bowled over by your skill as an interviewer and as a person who, for whom it benefits the show if the interviewee is not a nervous wreck, and you were just so masterful at just calming me down and making sure we'd get the best we could for me. And I remember that feeling, and it was live and the whole thing.
Live television is terrifying.
And the cameras everywhere, and biggest show on television. And I just remember this feeling of being in your hands. And just feeling so comfortable and relieved. And then you interviewed me years later on the occasion of Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston breaking up, and a movie that he was doing.
Because you had written a piece about it for
GQ,
right? And
that was another wonderful opportunity to be in your strong and safe hands. But back to what got me to the position of perhaps doing work like this was, as I anticipated whatever my next chapters would be, it just sort of occurred to me that it might be sort of interesting to collaborate with people with an interesting story to tell, because it's a lot of what I did, certainly through a long stretch of my career at GQ magazine, where I did a ton of the cover stories, a lot of profiles, a lot of interviews, and there was always this sense in which my job was to find the story, make a story out of something, and then of course write it well and all of that. But lots of interviewing and lots of finding the themes of people's lives and helping them connect the dots and have things make a certain kind of sense, so it's not just a sort of a rote sort of Q&A about your life. And I think I was talking to a friend at your agency, WME, and we were
Suzanne
just kind
Gluck,
of, well, actually, it was Jennifer
else?
Rudolph Walsh,
Oh,
and we
okay.
were talking about, what we might like to do someday when this chapter of our careers is winding down, and I kind of mentioned that in complete small talk fashion. And strangely enough, then, of course, Suzanne Gluck, your agent, was talking to her colleague Jennifer, and who are we going to get for the Katie project? And I think Jennifer was like, why not Lucy Kaylin? And Suzanne said, well, that's ridiculous. Lucy's got a very busy day job. She's editor of Oprah magazine. She's like, I think you should, reach out. And that's how it began.
And I think there are a lot of reasons why Lucy was such a perfect partner for me in this endeavor. And Lucy, one of the reasons I think is I'm a little older than you are, but not too much older. And and you and I both came of age in media really about the same time. And I also think we have weirdly similar love affairs with our father. Well, not really love affairs, but we, it wasn't an incestuous situation. Don't worry, everyone. But we really deeply admired our fathers, and they were really kind of behind us in terms of our professional accomplishments.
Yeah, they were both lovers of words and lovers of news and story and all that stuff, and they were crazy about their little girls. We're both youngers. I'm a younger, you're a young guest, and we spent a lot of time with those guys, and they had a lot of interest in what we would do and become, and we both badly wanted to make them proud. But another thing that I would say about, to your point about when women like us were coming along in male-dominated fields in the 80s. It's just unbelievably vivid to me when I was fairly junior at GQ magazine, and I had a tiny little studio, and I would, there was no such thing as an espresso. I couldn't afford a coffee press, whatever those things were called, and I would have a cup of Sanka in the morning.
Wow, and you are really dating yourself. And instant coffee, yeah.
Instant coffee. I had a futon on 19th Street, and I had a TV with rabbit ears, and every weekday morning, of course, it was tuned to the Today Show, and I'd already been noticing you as Pentagon correspondent, and you were kind of you were appearing more on the show, filling in, and I was super aware of it because I did not, as a rule, relate to the women who typically were in that sort of like sidekick to the alpha male role on those shows. I just wasn't, and I spied you as millions of young women did, and I'm like, well, that interests me. And I'll never forget that Sanka morning when you were like on the couch, because you were truly like filling in as co-anchor. And they were, of course, you learn in the book that, it's just a wonderful rise to the top. But that was such a big moment. And I saw it, and I was like, good on NBC. They're doing it. They're making the right move with that one that I like. And it was just incredibly important to me, and personally, professionally, and to so many women of, our vintage, just couldn't be more formative. Such a huge thing to have you model for us what it could be.
Well, it's interesting because looking back on it, I was a real anomaly for kind of the prototypical TV anchor person,
right,
to anchor woman. And I think because of that, I was very, very lucky that somehow broke through and resonated with viewers. And I think I was probably more relatable than most of the people who had been in that role. I had, this short kind of, Dorothy Hamley dark haircut, which I don't understand how my hair turned blonde as I got older. But, and I think that I was just cut from a different cloth.
Yeah.
And I remember when I got that job, I thought about looking at tapes of Jane Pauley, and then I realized to myself, just instinctively, I think to be successful in this job, you can't put on airs. You have to be yourself. You have to be authentic. And this was before the word authentic kind of had crept into the lexicon. And so as a result, I think, people like you who were, stumbling out of bed and drinking your Sanka, or people like Adriana who was eating her corn checks or whatever, her Eggo waffles. I think it made for a very sort of almost intangible connection with viewers.
100%. And it was also, just definitely your look was relatable for a lot of us, which was great. It didn't have to be that Barbie thing, which was very alienating for a lot of us women, we women who wanted to be taken seriously in these male-dominated offices. But the other thing was you led with your personality, and you led with your intelligence and your emotional intelligence and your wit and all of that stuff. And that felt new, because a lot of times it seemed to me the women that were relegated to the Barbie role weren't really supposed to do that.
Right, and they were also quite subservient to their male counterparts. And, one of the things we talk about when I got that job, which was pretty ballsy for a 34-year-old woman, was I insisted on an equal partnership with Bryant Gumbel, because I thought it was so important. I realized, I think, from my own childhood and how my perspectives were shaped by, Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journals and all these magazines that I'd go to my next door neighbor, Mrs. Geidels, and I'd read them in her sunroom because she got them all. Really weird, right, that I did that. But, how much popular culture and the images you're surrounded by, I was very cognizant that they really shaped your view of the world and your role in it. And I thought there were very subtle, almost nuanced things that people could watch on a show like that and pick up on that would make them appreciate the fact that women were as capable as men and that they should have equal opportunities as men. And I wondered if you picked up on that at all, Adriana, as a little girl watching it. Because honestly, when I asked for that, I asked for it for little girls like Adriana at the time.
Yeah. Well, I told the other podcast producers a couple days ago that I think it's so funny that, first of all, time-wise, Lucy and I are two generations of Katie fans, and she remembers when you had your first day on the sofa, and I remember crying, being 9 years old, standing in my kitchen when you said you were going to leave the show. But also, I feel like Lucy's experience of being your contemporary is being like, wait a second, we don't have to be this way. And my experience of you being my role model is assuming it always was that way. And so reliving this with both of you makes me so grateful that you did do it that way, so that I don't have to do it the old way. So I don't know if I realized it at the time, but
I wonder if your mom did, because it sounds like she was very keyed in on making sure that you reached your potential and that you satisfied kind of this intellectual curiosity you exhibited at a very early age,
well,
right?
it's funny. My mom is very independent, very headstrong, lots of things. I adore her, but she is the same age as you two, and she had a very different experience. She never really had a career. She worked until she had kids, and then she became a stay-at-home mom, and then she went back to school and became a teacher, which is great, and she's great at what she does. But it's just there is a generational divide among your generation, and I know if she could do it again, she would have had the career that I am having at 24, and I'm sure, whether subconsciously or intentionally, she made sure that I was exposed to things that made me realize the sky is the limit. And you made me realize that.
It's interesting that, of course, your daughters are really sort of the same age as my daughter, just a couple years older, and the same age as Adriana. And I know that it's very alive in us seeing this generation of women who are like no freaking joke. They're so talented and smart and ambitious and just capable, and I feel not sort of struggling with some of the things we simply had to because of the time that it was. It does feel like a victory. It feels like such a victory to see you guys being you. It's like, yay, some things do change for the better.
One of the things I really enjoyed writing, one of the reasons why I really enjoyed writing this book, and I think from the get-go, we wanted to use the backdrop of history and the backdrop of really 4 decades primarily for my story to illustrate some of the huge societal changes that have taken place during the last 4 decades. And I think sometimes we forget, Lucy, that our generation was really the first to be full throttle into the workforce. My mom never worked, and I talk about that pretty poignantly, I think, in the part of her book after she dies. But, I think I think it was like almost 50-50, and I don't know statistically if that's absolutely correct, but a lot of women, our generation, or some, were choosing to get married and raise their families and drop out of the workforce if they entered it at all. Mm-hmm. And then there were people like us who didn't want just a job, as we talk about in the book. We wanted careers.
Right.
And I think one of the things that motivated me is I really wanted to be financially independent. Mm-hmm. I could not tolerate the feeling of relying on someone else. And maybe that's because of my fear of rejection too. Mm-hmm. Can I lie down? I'm kidding. But, because I didn't want to be married have a man be the primary breadwinner and have him like dump me for a younger model,
Right.
and be left out in the cold thinking, holy shit, what am I going to do? I have these kids.
Right.
And and so it was really important to me, plus with the encouragement of both my mom and dad, to get out there and work. But I just think it's so interesting because I think we forget how we were kind of the first wave
Yeah.
of career women. Of course, there were people before us, and you hear about, Liddy Dole and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and people from my mom's generation. And as we talk about my friend Christine Hughes's mom, who was a doctor. But all my friends, I think almost, all of them had stay-at-home moms.
That's right. And by the time we were doing our thing, I think the thing that we obviously talk about it in the book is, we were like, soldiers in the mommy wars.
Right. And mommy wars, I don't even think you hear that term so much
Yeah.
anymore, do you?
Yeah, I think you don't. I mean, there really was, I think we remember it vividly, that sense of, there were at least two camps, and there was definitely that sense in which the choices that you made might be some sort of indictment, or perceived as an indictment of the choices somebody else made.
Right.
And, it was so vivid to me when I was, I had my first kid in 1997, and my second in 2000. And I remember so vividly going to, the preschool, and, I'm in my hard shoes and my jacket and my this and my that, because I'm going to go at drop off, I'm going to go to the office. And then there were those women who had a yoga mat, in the back of their thing, and, not the briefcase or what have you. And it was all very symbolic. It's like the ways that we were, doing our lives were, it was even just the optics of it were sort of dramatic. And you wrestled with it. And I totally didn't get to do the cupcake thing a lot of times, and I didn't get to do the pickup.
Or you missed important things because you were on assignment in another state.
I mean, I remember when, my son Owen, we're taking him to school, and, you're supposed to wear something that, bring something that was your assigned letter of the day. He was a little kid, and it was G Day for him, and I'm like, shit. I mean, I completely forgot to get him a thing for G Day. And then I saw that he was wearing a Gap shirt. And I'm like, honey, you've got a Gap shirt on. There's your G for G Day. I mean, it was like that. It was very catch as catch can. We just did the best we could. And I was always missing the memo on those kinds of fun, sweet little things. But I also was defiant, as you certainly were, about, I'm going to have a career. I'm going to do this thing.
And we were, we're talking about a group of women in a certain socioeconomic level who were really privileged enough to be able to make that choice, which is something that I'm always mindful of as well, that when it came to the mommy wars and any kind of, criticism of working mothers, there were a lot of women who didn't have the choice. And, for us, I didn't feel like we had a choice either, because we wanted something beyond raising a family. And I always struggle with this, because I do think that's such an important job.
Yeah.
And I never want to diminish that for women who do make that choice.
Right.
Like my mom.
Yeah. I do think it's really interesting in the book how incredibly intentional you were about, your career, but also, I'm going to be married, I'm going to have kids, that you really, like that Cassie Mackin moment, like, I am totally going to do this. It's not going to be easy, but, very, very intentional about the kind of life you wanted to live in the 90s.
I just read an article this morning that said single, unmarried women are the happiest, which I thought was interesting.
That's me.
Yeah, but you're 24, so. But yes, I think while I was hyper-focused on my career, Cassie Mackin, who you mentioned, who was the Capitol Hill correspondent for ABC News when I was the desk assistant, who had come from the Baltimore Sun, this, beautiful, tall, statuesque blonde who almost glided into the newsroom. I think we described her that way. Died of cancer in her early 40s. And I remember all her...
Unmarried.
Yeah, unmarried,
No
and all
kids.
her pallbearers, while they were really impressive, I think Teddy Kennedy was one of them, Rolf Tessum, who I remember as a cameraman, who went on a date with him, got a lobster and didn't kiss him goodnight, and he was pissed, but that's another story. But I remember seeing that and thinking, you know, I don't want to just be focused on my career. I want to have a family. I want to be married. I want to have children. And so I did kind of want it all.
Yeah, you became like a very prominent sort of emblem of all of that, and we all followed along very carefully.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of writing this book, because I think people might be interested on how we work together and kind of how we were able to take 64 years and condense them into a single book. You know, it's funny because when we first started writing, the book was way over, and
in length.
In length, yes,
And in deadlines.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember John saying, "Who do you think you are, Winston Churchill? What do you want, like several volumes?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's wrong with that?" But we realized maybe no one else was interested in me as much as I was, so we had to cut down a lot of the book. But you know, do you want to kind of just help people understand, because I think they might see the three of us and think, well, wait, how did this work? And I would say that we really had very few rough patches, if any. I think it just took us a little bit of time to, I think it's actually just an incredible story that we all like and care about each other as much as we do. I would even go as far to say that I would even go so far to say love. But I think there was a bit of an adjustment period, but not much. Can you talk about that, Lucy, and kind of what you experienced? Because we haven't really even talked about this.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was very, didn't exactly know what I was getting myself into, but because it was Katie, because it was you and your story, I was all in. Like, whatever this is, I'm doing it because I want to help tell this story. It matters that much to me. So, again, kind of calling on the work I've done throughout other parts of my career, certainly at GQ, but also the books that I wrote.
And I want to remind people, in case they want to go and order this, the second book you wrote was
Perfect
really interesting.
Stranger, yes, very much about what we were just talking about, which is the need that working women have to enlist the services of one hopes, impeccably loving, caring, gifted, talented, awesome woman you've never known or met before, who will be the nanny or babysitter to your children.
Right, who are entrusted with like the most important things in your life, you know, the most important aspect of your life, which came into play because we have a pretty harrowing story about one of my nannies, which, hey, go buy the book. But anyway, go ahead.
So anyway, yes, there was no real roadmap for this, and one of the things that I learned early on, or suspected early on, was going to be an issue is that you have so much going on and just a ton of really interesting things on your plate, running a company, being asked to do things, all over the country and the world all the time. And I was kind of like, oh, okay, so I'm going to have to find a way to...
And by the way, Lucy has a full-time job.
Right. There is that as well. But I did... The first really smart thing I did was I banged something out for you to look at. And I think, and obviously one of the things, and we did do some interviewing. You talked into a tape recorder, which was useful to me. I had some transcript to kind of play with when we sort of zeroed in on a section. But also, of course, there's a lot of great material that I could find myself. I could look up a lot of your interviews, and I could, look up a lot of articles about stuff that was going on. So like I could kind of piece together some stuff that was an attempt at, telling the story of a certain chapter of your life. And I remember the first time I did that and I sent it to you, it worked. Not that it was perfect by any means, but it engaged you and you're like, oh, no, I get that. That's interesting. I like what you did there, but that's not really, accurate, some of that. And then you were in. And then we started a process of like kicking things back and forth,
Right.
which was really great. And then there were times when, you know, you would do some stuff out of whole cloth, just like, take a look at this. I don't know if it's good, but this is what was happening when I was making this documentary and this crazy thing happened. And then I would help you bang it into shape. And then
Right.
I would try something out of whole cloth and give it to you. And then that kind of
And then
started
I would
happening.
sort of play with it and say no, or you know.
That
And I
doesn't
think the
sound
only-
like me.
yeah,
Sometimes you would
yeah,
say that.
or yeah, exactly, or it didn't really, as you said, happen that way, or you know, and a lot of times, you know, I really wanted to make sure this was my voice and from my perspective. And I think where Lucy was most helpful was kind of giving a sort of a more macrocosmic perspective of kind of what was going on in the culture. And you know, we wrote extensively about Anita Hill, and we ended up not being able to use it, and what it was like with my first experience really covering sexual harassment.
Right.
You know, and interestingly enough, how, I mean, we do talk about it in short form, but we had something
Right.
really long about it, and what that was like. And I think because we are contemporaries and you remembered those hearings so well, we could kind of share what impact that was having on society and how Anita Hill represented something that women knew and understood, but really hadn't put a name to it exactly. You know,
Yeah.
it's sort of crazy when you think sexual harassment, even though I experienced it and you experienced it early in our career, that was the first time that someone had really put a name and a face and actions
Yeah.
to the term.
I think another thing that was really interesting for us is, you know, there were times when you would say like, oh, go look at this interview. We should probably do something on this. You know, of course, I did these interviews with Reginald Denny from the horrific Rodney King aftermath, and Matthew Shepard and things like that, and these really important interviews that you did. And I would look at them and realize, that a lot of time had gone by. And for instance, there was a way that, discovering that your child was gay was talked about back then that would never be talked about,
Right.
Now. And the same thing with Reginald Denny, who, of course, terrible things happened to him as he was, beaten at the intersection of Florence and Normandy. But it was a very much about the white victim, and all of the stuff that would get surfaced in the Black Lives Matter, Summer of Black Lives Matter, was just like nobody even thought about it. They didn't even know how to talk about it. And you, so interestingly, when I kind of prodded you to take a look, let's take another look at these interviews that you did, and you were like, wow, I would never say that. I would never, your heart was all in it and you did a beautiful job on them, but it was a different time, and that became
Totally
part of
different.
the book.
Well, I think as I said, one of the interesting aspects of writing this was to be able to look through the lens of 2020 and 2021, and really 2019, and all the things that were happening in the culture, and then reevaluate these moments in time, whether it was
Matthew.
whether it was Reginald Denny or Matthew Shepard, and and the kind of pushback. I mean, I was sort of full of some pride, along with occasional embarrassment, of how I handled interviews, like David Duke, for example, and how I handled the governor of Wyoming, when we talked about conversion therapy, which was sort of all the rage, and asking about the impact. Sometimes there's not a cause and effect. Sometimes it's the atmosphere that exists and how it influences people's attitudes and ergo their behavior. So, to be able to talk about conversion therapy, and if in fact it fostered kind of this feeling of discrimination or intolerance towards gay people, was sort of an interesting avenue to go down. And so I think there are things that I would change, but then also there were moments when I was really, filled with pride that I had accomplished something, and that I had communicated something even bigger than the event I was covering.
Well, I think something that we found so interesting to talk about in the book, of course, was that for instance, at the time of the David Duke interview, you were, on fire as the most beloved, person on television.
Although
You
that
were,
was really quite early in my
yeah,
career. I mean, it
yeah,
was like early in the Today Show. I
yeah.
think I'd only
was
been there a year, right?
1991.
But
Yeah.
people were bonkers for you, and you were, on the road to America's sweetheartdom. And I remember, and we've talked about it a lot, you really had to wrestle, although not wrestle too hard, with the fact that, I might have an amazing smile and I might be America's sweetheart, but I'm going to tell some really hard stories and I'm going to go hard when I have to. And that decision that you made, that I think, to be honest, is a hard decision for a lot of women on television to make.
And not only on television, but I think women still struggle with these two sides of their personalities, wanting to be liked and wanting to be popular in the workplace, whatever work they've chosen, and also being able to make hard decisions and, tell people the truth without being labeled a bitch. And I think that one of the themes throughout this book is sort of the Katie Katherine dichotomy. And Adriana, tell everyone sort of how that plays out in the book.
Well, one of the most obvious places it plays out is on your first day on the Today Show, and early in your career, you went as Katherine. You were Katie Couric, covering the Pentagon. First day on the Today Show, Katie Couric, and you put your hands on your head and you say, "Gosh, I still can't decide whether I'm Katie or Katherine." And
which is sort of very much a huge theme in the book, isn't it?
Super prescient.
Yeah, and whether it's the stories you chose to cover, the way you carried yourself, whether you stayed at the Today Show, whether you went to the CBS Evening News, it's all a divide of Katie and Katherine. And am I the cute, perky, girl who does features, or am I this hardcore, serious journalist? And I think at your core, you are the hardcore, serious journalist, and you just have this packaging. We've talked a lot about packaging that allows itself to sometimes be taken in a different way as this silly, goofy, which you are, but you can be both. And
I think one of the things I've struggled with professionally my whole life is this need almost to categorize people, and to not see them holistically. And I think we're all, I feel like Bette Midler in Peaches. I'm deep. I'm very deep. Remember when she did that TV interview? And but I do think that somehow television, and we talk about this in the prologue, kind of puts you in a box and shrinks you down and makes you kind of telegraph a one-dimensional kind of persona. And I think what I always struggled with is, I think at my heart I am like a person that cares deeply, as Bette did in Beaches, but really cares about kind of getting to the heart of issues and helping people understand them and figuring out them myself, and hopefully as people see me figuring out things, it helps them. But on the other hand, I do have this sort of fun-loving, outgoing, gregarious style, personality, and it's really hard for people to understand you can be both, right? And I think it was interesting because part of my job on the Today Show was to highlight that kind of my personable side and my fun side and quick-witted, if I could say that side. But it sometimes came at a cost of people thinking, well, she's perky, which I think is a very marginalizing, diminishing word. I always think of Susan Sarandon and Bull Durham when she said, baby ducks are cute, and I the reason I bristled at that word, and the more I bristled, the more like the New York Post liked to call me that, is I felt like it was really sexist and really minimizing. And so I always felt like it was really hard to balance these two things. And we write in the book about when I did that David Duke interview, and I kind of had that velvet hammer thing going, that people at home were like, oh my God, Martha, what happened to that nice Katie Couric? And so it was trying to be taken seriously, because I am a weirdly serious person, but also making sure people enjoyed watching me. So that was always the balance on the Today Show. And I think when I went to the CBS Evening News, that really did create problems for me. Some of it was just old fashioned, run of the mill sexism, because I was a morning show person.
And how many men have been morning show
Yes, Tom
people?
Brokaw was
Yeah.
a morning show person as well, and John Chancellor was a morning show guy, and Charlie Rose, and but I do think it, just getting back to the whole packaging and the whole idea of images being so important. The fact that I am short and, cute, I guess you'd call me, and vivacious, um, that it put me in that box, and that box couldn't expand to say, well, she has a pretty keen intellect as well.
Right.
But when I went to the CBS Evening News, I think, that was kind of amplified.
Right.
Right. And people were like, oh, she's not a real journalist.
Well,
She's a
and
morning host.
That's so funny, because if you look at your record at the Today Show, everyone who you had interviewed, Yasser Arafat, all of the presidential candidates, you had so many hard interviews under your belt.
And in fact, I think I said at the time, I've done more hard hitting interviews than any of the evening news dudes combined. I mean, I don't know if that's totally true,
Probably.
but I had done just as many. I
Right.
mean, I didn't tally them up, but I think I had. And so, that was a really interesting experience for me. Interesting / horrible. Which you can read all about, of going to the CBS Evening News, which a friend of mine recently asked after she read the book. She said, do you regret it? And I don't really even know the answer to that question. Do I regret it? I try to live without regrets, but if I knew then what I know now, would I have made the move? Probably not.
Well, the way I think of you thinking of it, which is probably me projecting, but it's just someone had to be the first, and you were the first, and it sucks to be the first. And thank God you did it. And I think we say in that at the end of the book, I hope you made it easier for Nora O'Donnell and all the other women to come. But it just sucks to be the first.
I think I was not naive about it. I think because I had been so successful on the Today Show, I think that I thought that this blatant sexism, pervasive sexism, hadn't evaporated, but had what would be the word, you guys, had kind of
Waned.
Thank you, Lucy. And
The word wizard.
and the fact of the matter was, it was 2006, and I was like, oh, come on, people think women can do anything. And it was a really hard lesson in how, what a firm grasp sexism continues to have on our society. And I think I saw that not only with my experience there, but then, of course, with Hillary Clinton's candidacy.
and how acceptable it still
Oh,
was
yeah.
and is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's totally fascinating, really interesting stuff in the book, of course, is, you experienced your own really blatant sexism and had a lot of questions about the way these, bastions of male journalism operated. And, soon enough, only a handful of years later, we'd all find ourselves smack in the middle of Me Too. And, you obviously, had a lot of, proximity to that. And I know when working on the book, that was a huge thing for you to sort through and figure out, what you wanted and needed to say about it.
And I think what was almost therapeutic and cathartic about writing this book was, it was not long after Matt had been fired from the Today Show. And I think, I think what we tried to do in the book is really illustrate how I processed this, how I processed everything that was happening in the Me Too movement, but also how someone with whom I had a really nice professional relationship with and cared about, sort of how he crossed a line, but also how the environment that existed during, you know, the the high points of my career uh, really set the stage for something like this happening.
Yeah.
Because it was, so tolerated and really kind of considered part of the culture, not only in television news, but in a whole host of professions.
Yeah.
I've talked to my friends who are lawyers and who are, bankers and worked in finance or in, all kinds of careers, fashion, and the kind of behavior that went on that was acceptable. It's just really actually pretty appalling
Yeah.
when again you look through it through the lens of the 2020s.
Yeah. And, was not only sitting next to Matt and working with him for all of those years, but so many guys who were felled by this that, you had your brushes with, and it was a huge part of figuring out what you were going to say to sort of, what those encounters were like and what in retrospect was going on. I mean, Les Moonves, Jeff Fager, you certainly had some encounters with Charlie Rose. I mean, just so many with Harvey Weinstein, not knowing at all, of course, the extent of what was going on, but it just being in the world you were in and being who you were. It was all around, and that was, I know, a huge task for you to sort of sort through what the hell was going on.
And I think also, generationally, I see a very different perspective from people Adriana's age and my daughter's ages and Sophie's age, where I still have to kind of say when people will say, well, people were throwing themselves at him, or, she was really, she really pursued him, or this, that, about any of these people who were felled by the Me Too movement. And sometimes I'm like, yeah. And then I'm like, wait a minute. And I realize how easy it is to kind of switch and put the onus on women when really these men are in, it is a power dynamic. It's about power, but they're in these positions, as I write in the book, with, as Peter Parker would say, with great power comes great responsibility. And my girls always kind of, set me straight. But it's such a different perspective on sort of male-female relationships and the power dynamics in a workplace for young women than women our age. Having said that, I do agree. I talked to Jodi Kantor about this idea of believing all women. And as a journalist, I just don't follow that advice, because I think that our job is to get to the truth. And I think there are times when the pendulum has swung too much, and that with one tweet somebody's career can be destroyed. And it's really, really, really important that these stories are covered with a lot of care and diligence.
And just to play devil's advocate, though, and statistically, when you do get to the bottom of the stories, though, the women are often telling the truth. What is it, like 94% of women, or 94% of sexual harassment or assault cases end up being true? Women are telling the truth. But
Right.
I agree. They do have to be properly.
But that's a good, see?
Yeah.
There you go.
The young person in the room.
Exhibit A.
Yeah.
But Lucy, I think you and I kind of had to recalibrate our perspective in some ways, as two women, in their early 60s, trying to kind of, change our perspective, because I think we had become, in some weird ways, accustomed to what was deemed acceptable.
I was at GQ magazine for 19 years, and I was very, very, very much in the minority as a woman. And it was the 90s, it was the aughts. I started in the late 80s, and it was a pretty, fabulous guys who are great friends of mine to this day, really smart, really amazing, great mentors. But there was a frat house aspect, and the humor was bawdy, and there's a lot that you sort of took as a woman if you're like the only one at the conference table who, like, there was a lot of ribbing and things like that. And I think one of the things that was tricky for me is that, like, I mean, I think, and I think you do too, take a fair amount of pride in having survived those years in style. I mean, and this is something I have to be very careful about, is like, you don't want to in any way undercut the really important work that's being done now by, women and for women, for a more equitable workplace. But there is that kind of like, old school thing of, where when you and I came along, it was like, good on us for like finding a way and kind of getting through a really tricky time by our wits. So, I mean, it's just a very different workplace for women today.
Yeah, and I mean, good on us in some ways, but bad on us for maybe not me. I'm speaking about myself. Maybe not speaking out in certain situations because it was a question of survival.
Sure.
In some cases. I remember one of my one former anchor called a low-level employee a very disgusting word.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even know what it meant. Mm-hmm. That's how sort of shielded I guess I was. But when I realized it was, he was using a part of the female anatomy to describe her and saying it in front of other people,
yeah.
I said, you go to his office and tell him to please not call you that. I mean, part of me, I think I wanted her to stand up for herself.
Right.
And maybe part of me was afraid of backlash from him if I had been the one to bring it up. Mm-hmm. And she did, and I don't think he ever talked to her again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, so there were, we don't write about that, but there were incidents like that were really unacceptable that I think maybe I shouldn't have put up with as much as I did.
That said, though, I mean, that what you did at CNN, way back in the day when you weren't Katie Couric yet, I mean, that was brave. And people, young women who wanted to keep their jobs in places like CNN and, magazines and whatnot, didn't do that. It's a great story.
Yeah, and I think people should read the book because I can't remember the memo I wrote, but it was, pretty direct after someone had made an inappropriate comment about me, someone in a very high position. And, I credit my mentor, Don Farmer, for really encouraging me to do that. So I really appreciate that Don kind of, set me on a path.
Yeah.
That said, you don't have to put up with this.
Yeah.
Which was really, I mean, incredible when you think about how important that moment was for me, and made me realize that I could stand up for myself, even though I ultimately do believe it cost me.
Yeah, it's true. In the short term.
Yeah, in the short term, but it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was just going to say kudos to Don for being a man,
for
encouraging a young woman to...
And he was a male ally before we ever knew what that was, right?
Exactly.
So I think it would be very awesome to talk about where we were at when we realized we needed help with this book. We were writing away. We were having a great time. We were passing stuff back and forth. We were interviewing.
And also had given the proposal.
We were kind of rolling along. But, it became clear that this was going to be a massive undertaking, and it was going to be, hundreds upon hundreds of pages, and it was going to be a lot of research, and it was going to be a lot of everything. And let's just say, neither you nor I are like super, super genius with tech.
We're not super techie. No.
Hello, Apple.
Hello, Apple.
Not super techie. So, like a vision in the night, like an angel coming down from the sky, Adriana comes into our lives, and what was the?
It was really, I mean, we had been working on the book for how long?
I'd say a year,
A
probably.
year, really?
Because
No,
we had to,
no,
we
no,
had to
no.
work on the proposal, which took
Yeah.
months.
I know exactly when. It was about a month before I interviewed Katie, because I have since found in emails Katie emailing Lucy saying, Lucy, this young woman just came to my apartment and interviewed me. I'm going to ask her to help
I
us
think she
on the
could
book.
be really good. You said
You're going to
Yeah.
love her.
You're gonna really like
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
So what did you find?
So it's June 2019. I had just graduated from college, just moved to New York. And, well, first of all, I was really nervous to meet Lucy because I really liked Katie, and Katie and I seemed to get along from like the hour and a half I had spent with her. But I thought, oh God, Lucy could be a terror
bitch.
and I could have no part in this and be cast to the shadows. But no, Lucy's amazing and could not be more inclusive and not only willing but eager to hear my perspective and my take on things, which I very, very much appreciated as a 22-year-old at the time.
Which is
Yeah, well-
crazy, isn't it? But I mean, I think honestly, and I think, Lucy, you would agree with this, it was super helpful, as I alluded to earlier, to have someone of Adriana's generation kind of weighing in on some of the things that we were discussing, these big, serious, meaty issues. And, more than once, Adriana would say, well, wait a second. Or, hey, you all sound like you're ancient. You wouldn't say that. But you would pipe in. And Adriana is extremely, I appreciated how vocal she was.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people
Yeah.
would be intimidated, honestly, working with two old broads like us. And I think Adriana, her willingness to speak up and give her opinion and kind of say, I don't know if you want to frame it this way, was super helpful. Not only sort of on in a bigger way, but also just Adriana did so much research, and we'd have to find articles, or I'd say, gosh, I know someone wrote about my Bob Dole interview when
Yeah.
he got mad at me, and we couldn't even include that in the book, by the way.
I know.
And finding so many old pieces, and all I have to say is thank God for the internet. I mean, I curse it on a
Thank
daily
God.
basis when I read a mean tweet, but everything was so available to us. And we have to kind of give a shout out to the archivists, especially at NBC,
At NBC.
who were unbelievably helpful.
Art
ABC,
Hogan,
yeah,
my homeboy.
yeah. And also ABC was, CBS not quite as much, but
No, you could say that.
Yeah. No.
so but it was an incredibly time consuming, and thank God that we were able to find stuff online, and then they were able to dig through their libraries and send us stuff. Even CNN,
Yeah.
and the local stations, which were hilarious. One of our favorite pieces that I did back in the day was when I was at WTVJ, and I did a story about homeless people in the Miami area, and it was in the era of reporter involvement journalism, and I dressed up like a homeless woman, and it's absolutely,
It's the opposite of woke.
yeah, it is so mortifying and so horrendously bad that I'm just going to let people read the book and, God forbid, Google the story.
Well, the other really important part of how we put this thing together is Katie is a pack rat, and she has basically her own archive of sorts in her basements of this house, and she saved everything, which thank God she did. Speeches, articles, magazines,
Huge research notebooks full of stuff, like if I was going to Cuba, or if I was doing a piece on remember teens and sex that I did with my friend Sophia Fascionis, who was a great producer at NBC. I still had these huge notebooks, or from election
And
night, the
letters.
file cards and letters and speeches,
Yeah.
which proved invaluable. And the letters, they're I treasure them. Not only do I have letters from really famous people congratulating me when I got different jobs, but also letters from people who wrote to the girls when Jay died. So these letters that I have, I've always said if this house caught on fire, those would be the first thing I would grab if I could find them, because who knows where they are, because I'm a hot mess, a tornado, as John would say. But I think that's true. Like, just having those, even I saved the worst tabloid stories about me. When we had a situation where I had to fire a babysitter, and that was just hell.
I remember when you and I started, and the banker's boxes would be everywhere, and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize this was going to be part of the job. And I'm like going through these, like, just so much paper, so many stories in the basement here in your house with the scrapbooks and all this. And I'm like,
Scrapbooks.
I'm like, this is not going to get done. Like, I don't know what's going to happen here, because we got to pile up some pages. We got to do some writing. And among many, many, many things, when Adriana came into our lives and started making sense of all of that and started finding everything, and it was, just a godsend. And I think it was just I wish for anybody watching this, when you're doing a project, you can just, have a team like this, where not only did we have our respective, gifts and strengths and weaknesses and all of that stuff, but we had so much fun. And, we were just supporting each other all the time. And, you really, as we always say, the third leg of our stool, it was amazing when you came along.
And so much fun to be with. I think we all really enjoyed each other's company, which is, just amazing, because we spent a lot of time together around a dining room table here and in the city. And, it was a very intense experience. But the fact that, we not only survived, but we thrived and really enjoyed each other, I think is actually a miracle. And I want to give props to my parents, because my mom and dad kept these scrapbooks during the course of my career. Interestingly, sort of stopped keeping them when I went to CBS, because I think maybe the articles were all too mean to save. But, we always made fun of my mom and dad. It was so sweet and so tender that they would cut out these articles and put them in a scrapbook for me. And I think by the time, I was done at the Today Show, I had 4 or 5 scrapbooks. We started calling them.
More.
We started calling them. We started calling them Son of Scrapbook and Son of Scrapbook 2. And so, I'm so grateful to my parents. And in many ways, this book is a love letter to my mom and dad, and to my family, and to Jay.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a whole thing we haven't talked about yet. I think there's just really, really beautiful, amazing chapters concerning your family, your incredible daughters, your wonderful current husband, and certainly the tragedy of Jay. It's really strong stuff.
I think that, my hope is that writing so honestly about, Jay's diagnosis at such an early age, and it's still so tragic to me. I think people who have experienced those kinds of tragedies will really relate to what I was going through. And I think a lot of the feelings and the things I did in retrospect, I think will resonate with a lot of people. And that was really hard to do. I just actually almost finished with the audiobook of reading it, and to revisit those terribly, oh my God, impossibly sad and worrisome and fear-filled days was really hard. But I think it was I think it was some of my best writing, because it was so close to the bone and to my very being, and to be able to write about it, which I never would have done until now, because I always did feel it was an invasion of Jay's privacy that Lucy and I both pick at our fingernails. But, I think I hope it's a tribute to Jay. And I think a lot of the book is, because I think he comes through, and I'm just sorry that I couldn't write about Ellie's wedding and the ways that his presence kind of informed so many things that we did. But but I hope that people appreciate. And, sometimes marriages aren't always like in the very best place when a tragedy like this happens. And I think that sorting through that is really hard as well.
Well, I think another huge piece of it, I mean, yes, I think there are sadly many women who will relate to when something like this happens
And
to
men
your family.
too, I think,
and men. But the other thing that perhaps they won't relate to, and I think makes for really extraordinary reading, is you were at the height of your fame when this news came down. And, we talked a lot about the juggling is not a sufficient word, but the juggling of the public and the private, and the way those aspects of your life would come crashing together. Like, learning of your sister's diagnosis when you're on the the Tonight Show, and you're in the green room and you've just done a great performance. And, that was one of those horrible, and there were so many with Jay, just the way the public and the private, the professional and the personal would just come crashing together. And that was an interesting thing to sort through, I know.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we really wrote the bulk of this book in the middle of a pandemic, which added another layer of, and in the middle of massive social upheaval, right, in the country. And not to mention, the biggest political story of the last 50 years, I would venture to say, or at least one of the most transformative political stories, i.e. the presidency of Donald J. Trump. And so those things really, I think, impacted the process in a way. I would never say I'm thankful for the pandemic, because I would never say that, and I don't feel that way. But it did present us with an opportunity to really focus on the book.
Well, wait, let me tell this from my perspective a little. Well,
go ahead,
so
little Miss Pushy.
Yeah, I learned from my role model. So we were supposed to come out to the Hamptons to work on the book for a weekend, and because a lot of Katie's archives, as I stated, are in the basement here, and we were going to come out for a weekend to quote unquote ride this thing out, that thing being like March 11th, 2020. And then John called me the morning that we were leaving for a weekend and said, you should pack your bags for a week. And then I didn't leave this establishment until December.
Right. Adriana became an honorary member of the Couric, Molnar, Monahan family.
Yes.
And then I would nip in for a week
here
and there.
Yeah.
And we would just be in our pajamas all day,
I know.
bent over our laptops.
All day and all night. Because also, I would like to, Katie and I we like to work a lot. We like being productive. Lucy has a work ethic I have never seen and will never see ever again. It would be literally 1 a.m.
She is,
and we would be begging.
Preternaturally, preternaturally or preternaturally?
Either one is fine.
Okay, I usually say preter. I usually say preter. You say preter. I say preter. Let's call the whole thing off.
Yeah.
But Lucy is preternaturally focused. I have never seen someone who can just. I mean, I'm pretty good at tuning out the world, especially when I'm watching commercials for some weird reason on TV. I'm like, and people are like, hey. But Lucy and her laptop lying here just like in a little nest.
A creature in her nest.
Yeah, like, I don't know why I'm imitating a possum right now, but Lucy is just the most focused, hardworking person I think I ever met.
Yeah, it would be midnight and Katie and I would actually be begging to go to bed. And Lucy would say, no, we have to keep working.
Well, a couple of things on that. One is that I have a very, very, very narrow skill set. I don't know how to, I don't like to shop. I don't know how to cook. There's a lot I don't. So it's good that I have these skills because I ride them hard. These are my skills, and this is what I do. But secondly, just the material was so great. And, of course, fun working with you. But I love them. I mean, your life is just incredibly interesting. And, if it were crappy material, boring, you probably would have seen less focus.
Meanwhile, all these things were happening. We were having racial reckoning. We were having Me Too. George Floyd was murdered. Black Lives Matter was really, I think, reaching the
It's
masses
apex,
in
yeah.
a way it hadn't before, even though I think it had, you know, been around for many years prior, or at least several years prior. And, that was also fascinating too, because I think it informed and kind of brought into sharper focus many of the things we were writing about, and really gave a new perspective to some of our own implicit biases and our own view of different social situations or different societal issues, I should say. And so to me, it made the book much stronger. Um, that the country was grappling
Yeah.
with all of this, and that we were, and I think it comes through the pages of the book. Not to mention, there's a whole section on Jay and his love of the Civil War, and he was particularly enamored by the Confederacy and
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee, having gone to W&L and being a history buff even as a little boy,
Yeah.
with wallpaper of the presidents. And that was a really interesting and at times painful exercise in trying to understand what it was about these moments in history that so um, fascinated Jay, and that he really romanticized.
One of the things that I personally love most about the book, and something that we all worked really hard to make happen, is find how your incredibly rich and very personal singular story actually fit in the most interesting way into a kind of a cultural history of the last 4 decades. So again, what we were just saying about you coming of age in an all, a male-dominated newsrooms, about the stories that you did that just touched on the treatment of women, and all of that kind of stuff. The Hillary Clinton stories, the racial piece that you just talked about, what you just talked about with Jay and the civil, the fact that you went to UVA, and the Unite the Right rally was happening when you were in Charlottesville, when you were working on a documentary. Just it's really wonderful how your particular life illuminates some really important thematic stuff in the most interesting way, in the most personal way, sort of throughout the decades. I think that makes for a really wonderful kind of storytelling.
Let's talk about some of our favorite moments or our favorite part of this experience. Adriana, what was yours?
Well, thanks for asking, Katherine. um, well, so obviously I wanted to be Katie, blah, 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 blah. I always wanted to work in television, but
Blah,
blah, blah, blah. We've all heard it before. She has a million super fans. I'm just the president of the fan club. And Lucy's co-president, don't worry. But TV is admittedly very different now than it was back then. So one of my favorite parts to research and relive with both of you was the booking wars and the crazy shit they would do to get the get in the early 90s. It was cutthroat, to say the least, and terrifying and amazing. And as an incredibly competitive person, I would have thrived. And you have to read the book. Just that era of television, the once magical world of TV news. It was very fun to relive with the queen of it.
I love it all, but I love the early chapters, when you're, not at all famous yet, and you're just trying so hard in the most occasionally bumbling and always charming ways to kind of get your piece, and, just, get the assignment, get on air, whatever it takes. And it's really knowing what is up ahead. It's just so entertaining and really fun. But especially I love those, really strategic moments that are leading to your, getting the co-anchor job at the Today Show. It's goosebumps for me every time, and I know the story really well,
I know.
but it really is goosebumps. It's so kind of cinematic, and just funny and triumphant, and it's just scene by scene. It's great.
I enjoyed really all of it. it didn't feel like that sometimes at the time. But, I think for someone who becomes a public figure, whatever that means, that people write about you and they project upon you and they analyze you. And I think for me, it just felt so fulfilling to be able to talk about what it felt like at the time for me personally. And, there was so often I couldn't. And to be able to kind of take it, my entire life experience, and of course not my entire, because we had to pick and choose, but to really kind of share that was so gratifying. And for me, I think I really loved learning a little more, revisiting my roots and talking about sort of where I came from and my father's side of the family and my mother's side, and kind of talking about the fact that I discovered my mom was Jewish when I was 10 years old, because it's something I remember so, so vividly. And to me, that's such an interesting cultural uh, snapshot in many ways about what it meant to be Jewish growing up in Virginia, and assimilation, and maybe my mom's own issues. And, um, and again, it's something that shaped who I became. So just kind of learning about that, and reading about it again and learning more was really special for me. And I think something's a gift to my girls. I mean, Carrie's done all kinds of research already into our family history, and is, I believe, a much better writer than I will ever be. But, it was fun to kind of do that, uh, you know, in her footsteps in a weird way too. So I really enjoyed that. But it's really hard to even isolate one part of the book, because it was hard, man. It was hard, but I just loved writing the whole thing. I loved being with you too. And I think I've said this many, many times privately to Lucy and Adriana, but the fact that they never wavered in their interest and passion and enthusiasm for telling my story, I mean, it's such a gift, because, I mean, to me, it's so selfless. It's not your story, it's my story, but in a way, it's all of our story. And I'm so grateful, because never did you all say, oh, God, I'm so sick of you. Or you probably were, but like, I can't believe we have to work on this part again, or who cares, or honestly, and even behind my back, I don't think you were saying those things.
No.
And, you know, that is that is so, I mean, I don't even know how to put into words how wonderful and special that is for me. So
Oh.
I just really, really appreciate you guys. And, um, you know, there's so much of both of you in this book. And I could never, ever have done it without you. So thank you.